Hi, welcome back to High on Utah. I'm Heather Groom, and today I've got a special guest with me. Her name is Dr. Holly Richardson, and I've known Holly actually for
A long
a
time.
long time, probably
I
over
bet we're
20
pushing,
years.
20
Yeah.
at least, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
wild. So Holly has served in the legislature. She's just an amazing person. Fascinating. I actually want to know when your book's going to come out because I think you
I
should
don't have
write a
time.
whole life book.
Yeah.
Get Chat
Yeah.
GPT to help you, with this. But Holly's done everything from serving in the legislature. And I'll let her kind of tell you everything she's done. But one of the things that always just blew my mind is that Holly has 25 kids,
Yeah, it's true.
literally 25 kids. And I'm going to have her tell you a little bit more about that. You can also hear more from Holly on Inside Sources on KSL from 9 to noon on weekdays. It's a great show. I really like Greg Skordas too,
Yeah,
who's
he's my
on there with
co-host.
you. He's a really interesting attorney background. And when I was on the state school board, we'd sometimes have him come in and talk with us. And fascinating. I think the two of you together are great. And so it's a great show. If you haven't ever listened, definitely tune in. So,
Oh, thank
Holly,
you.
I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
So what's funny about the Greg Skordas thing is we've been working together now for about 5.5 months. We did not know each other beforehand.
Really? That
Like,
shocks me.
I had been a guest on a show that he had co-hosted. Like, we talked a little bit, never met face to face until we started doing the show. Now we're great friends and we work really well together. So the 25 kids thing. So I gave birth to 4 living children. We adopted 20, my husband and I, over a span of about 20 years, and we're raising a granddaughter who's number 25. So she's the only one that's not yet an adult. She's 11, and then everybody else is older. We have age 21 to 38, and we also have lost 6 kids. So that's quite a few. We had 19 living.
Like Holly, I just am like, Holly is in heaven. Literally, like, I just am like, Holly is just an
No,
incredible
no.
person. I mean, to do what you've done and also just help raise these kids that are just remarkable kids and have just needed some love. I mean, you've
Yeah.
opened your home and heart, and you and Greg, and
Well,
um,
it's been certainly it's been a journey and an adventure, and we have 10 grandchildren with an 11th on the way, and that's really fun. And I know that you're a grandma, and
I love being a grandma.
it really is fun, right? It really is some of the reward for getting through the teenage years.
You know, it's funny. Everyone tells you how great it is. And I just have to make this little comment. Everyone tells you how great it is, but it really is even 10 times better than that.
It
Whatever
really
you've
is.
imagined, it's even 10 times better. It's like, my grandbaby will call me and FaceTime me. And when she goes, Grandma,
I
like,
know.
I stop anything I'm doing. I'm like, hang on, that's my grandbaby
I know,
calling.
right?
It's like so pathetic. That whole FaceTime thing has
Oh,
been
it's so funny.
amazing.
Yeah.
But I love talking to Holly. She's very deep, she used to run Holly on the Hill,
Yeah.
the only real political blog, I'm gonna say. Like, I mean, just as in, like, you just were always just
It was,
so
yeah. So I've been
informational.
involved in Utah politics for 25 years now, and I keep saying that I hate politics, but here I am,
I
25
say
years
the same
later. So
thing. I say the same thing. I say I hate politics, the actual like politics, like the things that you think of that are negative,
yeah,
but I like policy
yeah,
making.
policy is really
And if you're
interesting.
not involved in it, you don't really get a choice on
So,
what's gonna happen.
yeah, it's really been fun. So, I am Dr. Holly Richardson, as you mentioned, and that's another interesting part of my story. So, my very first degree was a nursing degree. I was a 19 years old. It was an associate degree, and then I took a 30-year break, and that was where I was just really heavily involved in raising the family. And in 2014, I lost an election, and so I'm like, okay, I'm finally going to go get my bachelor's degree. And then in 2016, I lost another one, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go get a master's degree. And then in 2018, I did not run. I had learned my lesson, and that's when I started a PhD program. So,
I remember seeing all of it, by the way. That's what's
ah,
been so beautiful is like seeing your whole journey
yeah,
and
yeah,
just all the things. I mean, here Holly is with 25 kids and making pajamas. Like, this
I
is the other
know.
thing. Holly like made pajamas for her kids every Christmas. I was
Yeah.
feeling like the like
But
lamest mom,
look, the
right?
year I made 35 and did several all-nighters was the last year I did it. I have not done it for a number of years. I might do some grandkid jammies, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah, they deserve it. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I'm happy to have you here today because one of the hot topics that we've been talking about and that people have actually been texting me, calling me, people know that I do obviously real estate.
Right.
And I'm also very involved in politics, and I'm still a little bit, I'd say, involved in policy, right?
Yeah.
And just kind of community. So, something controversial that's come up recently nationally and then also in the state of Utah is redistricting and the congressional maps. It's a very highly contested. There's a lot of emotions
Yeah.
around it, and even judge and court orders and things.
Yeah.
And so, I'd love to kind of talk with you so that people that tune into this podcast understand kind of the redistricting, like when it happens, why
Yeah.
it happens, and then we'll touch a little bit on the national scene, and then let's talk a lot about the Utah.
So redistricting usually happens every 10 years after the census is done. So the US does a census every 10 years. So the next one is not scheduled until 2030. So typically what would happen is in 2031, then there would be redistricting that would happen. And that happens on a state level, but it also happens nationally because as people move around, like we used to have 3 congressional seats, now we have 4. There's starting to be some conversation that by the time we hit 2030, we might have 5
We might.
congressional seats because we have in migration, people still having babies in Utah. So that's how that works. So we have 435 members of the US House of Representatives, and then each state also has however many legislators they have. In our state, we have 29 senators and we have 75 members of the House. So typically what happens is after that census, you will get the Utah legislature will redistrict, meaning they will change the shape, and it's based on population.
And it's also kind of in the Constitution
It
as far
is.
as the legislature,
So
right,
it
should draw
is,
the
but
maps.
there's
There's
an
a caveat,
there's
yes.
an additional piece to that. But typically that's when that happens. And so what's really unusual is President Trump reached out to Texas, and the Texas governor is very friendly to President Trump, and he said, "I would like you to redistrict before the 2026 election, which is the midterm election a year away, and I would like you to get me some more Republican seats." And so the Texas governor said, "Okay, we'll do that." Well, once that process started, then there were other states who said, well, if you're going to do that, then we're going to do that. And California did that. And there's a handful, maybe a dozen states that are looking at it. Indiana was one that was asked to redistrict and get an additional couple of Republican seats. And they basically said no. They said the votes are not there. We don't have the support. We're not going to do it. So there's still a little bit of wiggle room. But the thing is, we're getting close to 2026. And even though the election is not until November, the filing deadlines are coming up really quickly. So Texas, as we're recording this, the day before we're recording this, there was a federal panel of 3 judges, one appointed by President Trump, one by President Obama, one by President Reagan, believe it or not, who looked at the Texas map and they ruled it unconstitutional. They said you did not just redraw this based on partisan outlines, you redrew it on racial outlines, and that is unconstitutional according to the U.S. Constitution. Well, the same day, Texas filed with the U.S. Supreme Court, so we'll see what happens. But their filing deadline is December 8th. That's basically 3 weeks from when we're recording this. And their primary is in March, right? Our primary is in June, but they're really coming up against the wire. So that's kind of the national scene is, are there going to be a shift in seats potentially? One of the things we know with midterm elections is that usually the president's party, the president who's in power, the other party wins the midterm elections. So I think that we probably will still see that, right? But this redistricting move can affect that. Now, Utah is different. Utah is not based on somebody coming in and saying, we want you to redraw a seat. Utah's redistricting discussion is happening because there was a lawsuit after the last redistricting cycle, which was in 2021.
Yeah.
So we have to even go back further than that. In 2018, there was a proposition.
That's what I was going to talk about, the proposition.
Proposition 4, it was passed into law. Now, what Proposition 4 did was say, it basically said that the Utah Constitution says the legislature, in one section of the Constitution, says the Utah legislature shall draw maps. But in another section, it also gives the people of Utah the rights to affect and impact their government. And so this is that piece of the Utah Constitution is what has been used for the judge to say the Utah legislature did not listen to the will of the people who passed Proposition 4. It passed by a very slim
Hmm.
margin, but as you know, in politics, you can win by one vote and it's still a win,
It's a win,
right?
right?
So this proposition passed in 2018, and it basically said we want to form an independent redistricting commission, and we're going to submit maps to the Utah legislature. They can take them or they can leave them, but they have to follow these other constraints in Proposition 4. They are supposed to keep communities of interest together, avoid chopping up counties, cities as much as
Hmm.
possible, and also not look at partisan data when they make these maps. In other words, you can't say, well, I know a whole bunch of Republicans live in that neighborhood, so I'm going to carve that out and put that in mine, right? That's what that said. So this lawsuit has been in the works since 2022, I think.
Hmm.
It's taken a long time to work its way through the system. So basically in August, third district court judge ruled that the maps that were put into place in 2021 did not actually meet the constraints in place of Proposition 4. So what that meant was she instructed the Utah legislature to redraw maps and gave them a deadline to resubmit those. Now, I think there's been some misunderstanding about who can do what at what time. So the lieutenant governor, who's over elections in the state, had said our drop dead date
Hmm.
is November 10th. And by what she meant by that was we have to let county clerks know, because they're actually the ones who administer the elections, right? We have to know what those boundaries are so county clerks can know, so that candidates can know, so that voters can know.
Because there's filing deadlines.
There's filing
And the
deadlines.
big thing that people don't realize, and I think, we both are good friends with the lieutenant governor. We know
Yeah.
her well. And one thing that I think she pointed out recently is, when you really look at these boundaries, I mean, you have sometimes streets being chopped up,
Yep.
like your one
You can
neighbor
even have a
might be
house, right?
one house
Yeah.
over is in a different congressional
Yeah.
area.
Right.
And what do you do, especially when you're looking at like these legislative seats,
Yeah.
right? For Utah, these filing deadlines are coming up.
Yep.
And so the lieutenant governor's office has to know who and where do these homes, like every single home
That's right.
needs to be identified. So to really think about that on the molecular level, every single home needs to be identified, not just on the congressional boundaries,
Right.
but also House, Senate, state, and like they've got to know that information. So this is going to be a terrible Thanksgiving and Christmas for anyone in that lieutenant governor's office. You and I both have worked in politics, so we know how this goes.
Yeah.
And this is not just something that it's like, oh, just hey, we've drawn out this
Right.
these boundaries. Like it gets you're
Using
looking really
AI.
molecular. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And sometimes it doesn't make sense where the lines are drawn. It doesn't feel like it does sometimes. And the current maps right now divide Mill Creek, for example, in Salt Lake County into
Yes.
4 congressional districts. That's where the 4
Mhm.
slices of pizza meet together. So what has happened is the redistricting right now is impacting Congress, but you're right that there are also, for example, a Utah House district may end up, if they're in one
Right.
where the split occurs, they may have 2 congressional districts in their
Exactly.
House district, right? So filing is the beginning of January. It's before the legislative session
Mhm.
starts. It's right after the new year. And right now, we don't know for sure what the boundaries are. We're pretty sure, right? Because the judge has issued a ruling. The judge issued a ruling on November 10th was the drop dead deadline. And it was 11:41 p.m., 19 minutes to midnight, when the judge
Yes.
issued her ruling. And her ruling was that the map submitted by the Utah legislature was extremely partisan in its nature. And she selected a map that was submitted by plaintiffs. Now, she also had said this is a possibility. You have to meet these criteria in Proposition 4, or you will basically force the court into choosing a map. It made a lot of people really unhappy to have
There
her
was
say
a
that.
lot of blow up. If you were on, any of the social platforms
Yeah.
or listening to inside sources or any of the
Yeah.
even like Deseret News, anything, there have been a lot of articles on this, and there have been a lot of misunderstandings. That's why I think it's important that we talk about this, because I love how you're describing this and putting together this timeline. And people were blowing up and villainizing people. There were even death threats. I mean, it was getting pretty
there's
ugly.
ongoing, right? And so there's, for example, there's pushback on the lieutenant governor saying disobey the court order, and it is a direct court order written in the 91-page decision that was released on November 10th, and it literally says, "I order the lieutenant governor to take these maps and apply them to the 2026 election." Well, there are some people who
Right.
say, "Well, don't just disobey." Well, we believe in the
No.
rule of law largely, right?
Right.
I mean, and so you can't just say, well, just ignore it. One of the things that's interesting is the process then is for the legislature to appeal. And I think they're not going to. It's already been a week past that point, and Speaker Mike Schultz, who's the Speaker of the House in Utah, has said recently that he feels like they were forced up against the wall time-wise, and they just don't have time to file an appeal to have it have any impact at all in 2026. So I think that these maps, the judge said, we're going to pick this map. This is the map. It's a donut hole map, which means in Salt Lake County, there's a round donut where
Yes.
you've got that population center. It still divides Salt Lake County because the county's too big for one congressional district. You've got the northern part, which is still very similar to what our current District 1 is, but that will become District 2, and then you split in the middle down the state, and so you have a 3 and a 4. So those boundaries, I'm pretty sure, are going to be what we see in 2026. Now, 2028, who knows?
I was going to say, because I think then maybe there could be an appeal. There could be other things that happen.
I think for
but
sure there will be an appeal.
Right now, we are just down to the wire, and I don't know. I mean, it would be chaos. And like you said, we do believe in obeying the rules of the land. At least I do, right? And you do.
Yep.
And so at some point, the lieutenant governor's office has to just move forward. I mean, this is what the court ordered, and they are. And that's what I think I also agree. I think it'll be implemented for the 2026 election cycles. And these are midterm elections. And so there's a high probability that one of these seats will actually go Democrat.
I think it's almost a certainty
I think
that
it's
this
certainty
donut
too.
hole will be a Democratic held seat. It's interesting to me in Utah, because we're so heavily Republican. Usually we see, especially in what's considered an open seat, we usually see a ton of people, jumping into the race. We may have 6 or 10 or 12, right? It's a lot of people who jump in. So I think at last count, I've seen at least 4 people officially confirmed in the race for that seat, which will be CD1, Congressional District 1. And there's at least that many more out in the wings where there's some rumbles. So it'll be really interesting to watch it on the other side.
Yes, it's kind of nice to be on the other side, actually. But, definitely, I agree. I think one seat will go Democrat, most likely. I have kind of mixed feelings because I've campaigned statewide, for Governor Herbert. And, the hard part is the rural aspect, right? Because some of these seats, I can see both sides where some people say, well, Salt Lake County should have its own seat. I get what they're saying, but Utah is such a different state in that we have these rural areas and they have very distinct problems, even county to county.
Sure.
You go to Carbon County, you go down to Washington County, you go to whichever one you want, and they all have different issues.
They do. Yeah, they do.
It's a tough one because I was looking at, if you were to drive, let's see, what would be congressional number?
I think it's
3, isn't that right?
I think it might be 4 if you're thinking like Uinta all the way down to
all the way,
Kane County.
kind of like a C almost. Down to Kane County, and because of the different national and state parks and different things there,
driving.
It's like it would be a drive. Didn't we figure it out? I think it was like 18 hours from the top of how you would have to go around.
It's a lot of hours.
I mean, we're talking, that is not a very accessible area, and it would be tough. And there's, you're not just flying on a plane to get there either.
You could,
Look,
yes. we'll see. I think that for 2026, we're going to use these maps and we'll see how it plays out. I think there will be an appeal. I know that they have spoken about appealing all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which doesn't mean that the Supreme Court will actually take this
That's
as a
right.
case, right?
Exactly.
And the other thing I think that's important to know is there have been calls to impeach the judge. Now, impeachment is a very high bar, and by law, it has to be malfeasance, um, high crimes, or misdemeanors. And misdemeanors are not actually a specific level of crime in this situation. It's called a term of art. It's how they describe the level
Yes.
of basically malevolence and misdeeds, knowingly acting poorly. That is a really high bar to meet. But that was the first reaction from the Utah legislature, is to say, well, we'll just impeach the judge. Right. So there are, of course, people on the other side who are saying, okay, just because the ruling is not one you like doesn't mean that you go and impeach the
It's
judge.
not an impeachable offense. I've been a paralegal, and from what my limited knowledge, I always say I know enough to be dangerous to myself and others. I would not see that as an impeachable offense.
Well, I don't
unless
either.
there was some kind of bribery or some kind of actual
yeah.
issue that would be a crime. I don't see how that
So
would be.
what
it.
impeachment entails, right, is it's basically like a criminal hearing, except that the party that has to present their, either their defense or, the prosecution, it goes in front of the House, and then the Senate is the one that would impose sentencing, if you will, and whether that's removal from office. So we've seen that on a national level where presidents have been impeached but not removed from office.
That's true.
Clinton and Trump both were impeached but not removed from office. And then if you look at locally, we had a conversation a number of years ago where there was a move beginning to talk about impeachment proceedings against the sitting attorney general, which was John Swallow at the time, and he resigned before that ever got to a full impeachment proceeding. But this is a very long, detailed process. And they would have to prove, like you said, malfeasance, high crimes, or misdemeanors on the judge's actions. They're saying they believe the judge acted against the Utah Constitution, but I'm telling you that there's two competing parts of the Utah Constitution, and that's where it comes down to. Is it Proposition 4? Is it this piece that says the Utah legislature has the sole authority to draw these maps? You mentioned Governor Herbert. He's the one who appointed this judge. Her name is Diana Gibson. And he has said publicly that it is laughable to think that she is a liberal judge. He was a Republican governor. He appointed her. She was confirmed unanimously by a Republican dominant Senate, right? And now all of a sudden she's, of course, the pariah.
Right.
And one of the things I learned from Greg Skordas, my co-host, is there are like 17 judges on the 3rd District Court, which is where this lawsuit went. You don't get to pick what cases you take or don't take. And he's pretty certain, Greg Skordas is, that she would never have volunteered to take this case, right? But it was assigned to her.
I don't know if anyone would, really.
Right,
I mean, it's a little bit of a hot potato.
Exactly. But it was assigned to her, and so she had to do her due diligence, and she has done. I don't know her personally. I've never talked to her personally, but her rulings are very, very detailed. There's a whole lot of legal precedent that she includes in that. We'll see where that goes, but it became very personal, I think, for people in the legislature.
Yes, I agree with that. And now, one thing kind of related to that as well, she did adopt one of the maps that was presented by the plaintiffs.
Right.
And I don't think people realize that. I think some people are under the impression that she just drew these maps up herself.
She did not draw the map. And so here's one of the things that's interesting. So when she made her original ruling in August, which it took a long time, right? Because I think this was maybe March-ish where she had all the information. It took a long time to make the ruling. When she did, she instructed the legislature to go draw a map, but she also added the caution that if they drew a map that did not meet the guidelines, she was also going to ask the plaintiffs to submit maps. So she did ask the plaintiffs to submit maps. They submitted a couple. So after the legislature chose a map, submitted it to her, plaintiffs had submitted maps, what she did was she took she had hearings, 15 hours worth of hearings where both sides could say, this is why we complied with Proposition 4, right? And this is why we don't think the other side did, basically. So she took that into account as well. And then she took additional time to review everything. Now you have to know we're using AI now to draw these maps. And so there's algorithms involved. And she went into some nitty-gritty detail, but she had hours and hours of testimony about why these maps either did or did not fit Proposition 4. And she ended up ruling that the one the legislature submitted did not meet the requirements, and she chose a map that the plaintiffs had submitted.
And who are the plaintiffs? Do you remember?
Yeah, so it's a group of
Isn't it a group? Right.
it is a group. So you have Better Boundaries, but you have the Utah League of Women Voters, and you have Mormon Women for Ethical Government. You had Alliance for Better Utah, and then Better Boundaries, right? So at least those four. And the map that the judge ended up picking, and she said it was the least partisan of any of the maps, and that was the one submitted by the Utah League of Women Voters.
Right.
Which has been around for 100 years, basically since
and it's
Utah's had suffrage.
Right.
Yeah, it's nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan as well. I think we've both been at different meetings.
Or they have Republicans and Democrats in
Yes.
the leadership, people who come and speak, right? Republicans and Democrats. I think they have been under attack. Mormon Women for Ethical Government has been under attack because, people like to name call when things don't go their way. And so they've been on the receiving end of some pretty pointed comments and threatened action.
Right. Yep. I've been kind of paying attention to that as well. It's going to be interesting to see how it also plays out in these other states.
Yeah.
So just kind of briefly, have you been following what's going on in Texas and California?
Yeah. So California passed their redistricting, and they had to go to the voters, like I mentioned earlier. So they have redrawn their map that will give likely five additional Democratic seats. Texas redrew their map, and they were the first, but Texas redrew their map and would give 5 Republican seats, although it went from strong Republican to lean Republican because you had to dilute some of the strength to be able to get these maps. And then that is where we have this panel of federal judges saying we're not going to accept that. So that case is in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the DOJ is now suing California, but not Texas, interestingly, for doing this redistricting mid-cycle. And then there's a handful of other states that are looking at it, but they don't have the population. So you may see 1 or 2 change hands, right, per state, but it's not significant.
It's not significant, right? Exactly. I think it's going to be interesting to see also, to your point about AI. It seems like every conversation we have to mention AI somewhere. It's going to be interesting because it would be very tempting for certain people that are drawing boundaries to access information because more information is going to be readily available, right? And using AI to, if they're asking questions about, political affiliation, do they have kids, what religion, there's a lot of information out there that you can find out. And I think with the future, I'm not one of these that's like so afraid of AI. I think, you're going to have great things. You're going to maybe have some other things that we're going to have to need to look at. But overall, for people that are in charge of these, redistricting, like even if they're seated on, like you're saying, these panels, everyone has a little bit of a bias, or maybe at least an opinion, I'd like to say. Maybe they have good intentions, but they still are opinionated. And what's going to be interesting is with the AI component, like you're saying, there's more information out there. And what does that look like?
So part of it is what you tell AI to take into account, right? So there are programs that meet the requirements of Proposition 4 in Utah, for example, to say don't take partisan affiliation into account. And so they don't, right? And so it will say, okay, well, here are the parameters you gave me.
Like population, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Right. And saying, and try to keep communities together, right? So you're not splitting Midvale 4 ways, or Mill Creek, 4 ways. So one of the things that I think is interesting about AI is it always comes down to what's the input that you have put in, right? What are the parameters you have actually given the program? And then what does that look like when you spit it out? So it can spit out 100 maps. And the redistricting part before AI, very complicated, took a long time, right?
I remember. I remember.
And even with computers, right? But without the use of AI who can draw some of these things for you, it really was that, well, what about this right here, right? I mean, it has really been laborious. So AI has made it easier, but you're right. I mean, it's one of the things that you have to take into account. Now, when we're looking at redistricting mid-cycle, that's never been done before. It really has never been done before. And I think it's clear, not in the case of Utah, because that's a court case that's been ongoing
Well,
for
it was
multiple years,
because of Proposition 4
right?
too,
But the
it
other
trickled.
states doing this, it is clearly political, right? It started with President Trump going to Texas and saying, "I want 4 more seats." And I think the reason is because right now, as you look at the U.S. House, you have 219 Republicans, 214 Democrats. It's a very, very tight margin.
Hmm.
And all you have to do is swing a couple of seats, right? And then 3 seats really, and then they lose the majority. Republicans lose the majority. And midterms are not favorable to the president in power, almost always.
Right. It's almost used as a
So,
buffer, like a little
yeah,
bit of like a checks and balance. And,
yeah,
if you look
it, yeah,
historically,
historically,
just like you're saying, typically, like even when President Obama was in
yeah.
or Biden,
It
it's like we
it
flipped.
swings,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
And
right.
and people know that, voters know that. I think representatives know that. In fact, they've talked about we've got 2 years to get our agenda passed because
Right.
of these midterm elections. So one of the things, again, that we're looking at is, will there be enough change in seats that doesn't end up tied up in courts that it's going to make a difference in the 2026 election, or is it just going to be what we typically see? The balance of power is going to swing to the other party.
Yeah. No, these are all really great points. And I'm
Well, I'm
like,
just
I'm
really wonky,
loving.
so I hope it was
No,
understandable.
this is I love it. I love all the data. I love the numbers. It's going to be interesting to see how this, kind of plays out,
Yeah,
not just in Utah, but also nationally.
yeah.
I feel like sometimes people have over politicized things
Mhm.
that have not maybe been so much in the past. I mean, obviously, there's always been politics, right?
For
Since the
sure,
beginning of
yes.
time. But at the same time, it'll be interesting to see how these play out. Any other political issues that you're kind of thinking about right now?
Well, as we head into the legislative session, what I'm watching is retribution from the Utah legislature, and I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the legislature trying to squash citizens' ability to do citizen initiatives. I think that that's on the table for sure.
I'm really worried about that too,
I'm
actually.
worried about them lashing out against the judiciary. I'm also worried about them lashing out against the executive branch, right? And I think those things are concerning, right? We're supposed to have equal three equal branches of government that balance each other out. It's not supposed to
Mhm.
be
Legislature.
one and then two underneath them,
Yes,
right? It's
yes.
not supposed to be hierarchical. It's supposed to be a
Right,
level.
right.
And there are supposed to be checks and balances. And I am worried about potential punitive legislation that I've already heard being proposed. So I am
Yep.
worried about that.
I've heard of a few people carrying around already their bill files and their,
Yeah.
kind
And
of like
this is
what
the
they
time
want to
of year,
propose.
right? One of the bills that I probably will not pass, but I would love to see it pass. It is by Representative Okerlund, who's lives up in Salt Lake County. He wants to put a limit on the number of bill files
That
that
I have read
legislators
this,
can open.
and you know what? I'm actually all for it.
I know, me too, but I don't think it'll
Because
pass.
it's been ridiculous actually, like in the
Yeah,
last few years. And maybe you know these numbers. I don't know them off the top of my head,
yeah,
but I do know that we have probably 4 times the amount of bills
yeah.
that ever used to be proposed or more. It's
Record
record
number. So I
numbers,
think
right?
last year, I could be wrong. I think it's somewhere around 1,200 bills were proposed. Not all of those got drafted all the way. I think that the legislature ended up discussing about 900 bills, and they ended up passing 560-ish bills. But you have to also understand that the majority, meaning over half of those bills, passed the last week of the legislative session.
Yeah, I'd even say last few days, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen that.
Yeah, as
Um,
discussion starts to
yes.
decrease, you get 1 minute, right, to talk about this bill, and so I'm not sure that that's a great, the
And
best
thank you,
use of time.
legislators. I want to be. It sounds like maybe we're bashing them. We're not trying to. It's just that I think that sometimes there have been instances where I think it's hard because first of all, they're on a time limit,
Yeah,
right? We don't have a full time legislature like some other states do,
right.
and which I'm actually glad that we do not, but for different reasons. But I mean, it's one of those situations where I think it's good that we have a short time frame. We do have emergency sessions occasionally to address things,
Special sessions,
and things like that. But overall, and I get it. I've been an elected official, and it's grueling and it can be hard. But just to kind of even give this point, when I was on the state school board, we would have so many bills that were education driven. Like, it was so difficult to even stay on top of how many different bills impacted education or something that fell under the Utah State Board of Education. And so we were constantly watching. We were on the Hill. We had updates all the time. And then the tricky part that people don't realize, and I didn't realize this before, was that, after there's, basically, they're passed, then you're waiting to see if anything gets vetoed, right? And sometimes they are. And then by the time we actually analyzed what was in the bill and we understood it and what directives we were given, I mean, that took months. Then we'd have to plan to implement. And by the time
then you'd have another
implementing,
legislative session with different bills.
Yes. And then we would have also that implementation cycle. So sometimes we were implementing in September, October, November, and then we start the legislative cycle all over again in January. So it was almost a full-time job just keeping up with what was being basically what came into law, what we needed to look at, what we needed to implement, what we needed to change, understanding even the financing, the notes, the financial impact of all of these things.
And you can have a bill passed,
it was hard,
and then the financing can be stripped out at the last minute. And so technically
we had that happen.
It's in place, but there's no way to fund it, right? Because the funding's now gone. Right.
So we had that situation sometimes where we'd say, well, where's this new directive going to, what are we going to do with this? And so it really is an interesting dynamic and dilemma. And so kind of wrapping back up, and, I love those things that you've pointed out, because this next legislative session, I think it's going to be interesting. I'm sure we're not going to hear the end about these congressional maps. This is going to be an ongoing discussion for a while. I think we're where we're at right now. We're going to see, because this is where we are. We have to be.
I think what's interesting too is a few years ago, it hasn't been that many. The legislature changed when you file. So it used to be right after the end of the legislative session.
That's right.
The session would end on Friday, and you could file, I think, maybe on Monday. Now you have to file before the session starts.
Yes.
So I think that actually changes the nature of some of the bills we may or may not see, right? It depends on who's running against me as a legislator, or maybe I don't have an opponent running against me, right? So that's different. I've heard of at least one person, Carrie Ann Lisabee said she's not running again for the House. So that's one person who's announced. But you're going to see more and more, I think, as you get closer and closer to that beginning of January, people say, you know what, it's been an honor to serve, and I'm not going to run again. It was really interesting. When I got involved in Utah politics, I was working on one specific bill for midwives, and it passed 20 years ago in 2005. And when I looked recently at who in the Senate had voted for the bill and who had voted against the bill, there was not a single senator still there. In 20 years, it rotated, and the House rotates so even faster than the Senate.
The House rotates so quickly. I mean, it's very interesting, because some people have this impression that these politicians stay forever.
And sometimes they do.
Some do.
In
but
Utah especially,
rare.
it rotates.
Especially the House, like you said. I mean, in the House, you have a lot. And, it will be interesting, because, again, another kind of topic of controversy would be also signature gathering. So it's going to be interesting to see who elects to go through caucus and convention, and who also decides to do signatures, and even the thresholds. We every year we've talked a little bit about thresholds and how many signatures you need for a statewide race, or county commissioner, and there still are some that need to be brought back, like county commissioner. I feel
They're so high.
That
The bar is
threshold
really
is
high.
so high for county commissioner, and it would be a very expensive race if you have to gather that many signatures, and so it's difficult. So that's going to be something that I think we're going to still hear more about, probably in this next legislative
Yeah.
session as well. So
Yeah, for sure. I think that will be the case. And like you and I pay attention, and it's going to feel like, didn't we just have an election? And the answer is yes. And the next one has already started.
that's right. That's a very good point. And that's probably how we'll end today, because that is how things go in Utah, right? It's like, the next election has already started,
Yeah.
and we're going to see like a little bit more. We're going to hear more about the congressional maps. We're going to hear more about upcoming bills in the legislature.
Yeah.
And we'd love to have you back, especially during the
Happy to come.
legislative session.
Yep.
We have a lot to talk about, I'm sure.
Happy to come talk to you anytime.
Well, thank you so much for joining us
Oh, my pleasure.
today. Okay, thanks so much for tuning in to High on Utah.